Hey everyone, Blorp here. Super excited today for our first episode of Beginner's Breakdown, where I'll be analyzing user-submitted chess games from beginner players rated generally less than 1200. We'll only be analyzing games of beginners against other beginners. You'll find some other videos of the world's best chess players destroying beginners, and while entertaining, that's the chess equivalent of LeBron James dunking on middle school kids, so we're not going to do that here. My goal is really to give you practical ideas to take your chess to the next level. We'll be diving into tactics, strategy, and a little bit of psychology. And for each player, I'll be identifying specific strengths and weaknesses and giving some personalized recommendations. So who am I? Well, I started playing seriously when I was 20. I'm mostly self-taught and rated around 2,000 on chess.com and 2,100 on Lichess. I've played collectively over 20,000 games across my online accounts. So I know a little bit about chess, and hopefully you find today's video instructive. Also, this is our first video of this series, so if you have any feedback, that would be greatly appreciated. Our 3 games today come from Brock in Australia. Thank you, Brock, for submitting your games. These will include 1 win, 1 draw, and a loss, and all of the games are 10 minutes time controls with 0 seconds increment. This is a really good choice for beginners. It has enough time that you can really think about each of your individual moves, but there's still time pressure, which is a skill you need to train at all time controls. Brock has also annotated his games for us, so we can get some insight into his thought process. Brock started playing in the past month after watching the Queen's Gambit. He's just made it past the 1000 elo after dropping to 600 when he first started, and his next goal is to crack 1250, although he found getting through 1000 took quite a bit of time, so he's looking for some new ideas to shake things up. Well, first of all, if you've only been playing for a month and you've already hit 1000, you're off to a great start. It's going to be harder for you to go from 1000 to 1250 than it was for you to go from 600 to 1000. Let's take a look at game 1. In this game, Brock is playing as black, and after white plays d4, black opts for knight f6, and we enter into a King's Indian defense type structure. White plays this f3 move, which Brock says is mysterious. He doesn't really understand what's going on. And to be fair, it's not the most accurate move for white, but the idea is very clear. The intent of white is to grab control of the center by playing this e4 move. This f-pawn supports this push into e4, which would give white strong grip over the central squares. As a result, something black should consider in this turn is to play d5 yourself, which adds additional support and prevents white from immediately seizing the center with e4. Additionally, this also gives your light square bishop some additional scope, developing your bishop. So it's a strong move to consider. If you did play in the game, you'll note here you spent 1 second making this move. So I know you did not actually consider the repercussions of this f3 idea. I strongly encourage you as a beginner, even in the opening, to spend around 10 seconds on your early moves, unless you absolutely are confident in your theory. That'll allow you to consider what your opponent's plans are, and hopefully you'll be able to find some of these ideas on your own, and I think you could have found d5 in this position as well. But the move you did opt for, bishop g7, is still sensible, and this is going to allow you to castle early. Any opening, I think, that allows you to castle early and develop quickly is a good opening for beginners, so I think in general this is a good opening choice. So after bishop g7, white develops their bishop. Black plays this d6 move. Brock here says he didn't realize that his light square bishop was interacting with their newly developed bishop. That's okay, but having board awareness of this long diagonal is important and will come up later in the game. But this d6 move is fine. After bishop g5, black plays e5, thrashing out at the center. And the idea kind of makes sense. Your goal is to expand space in the center, but this actually fails tactically to the following. The most obvious move white has is just recapturing this pawn. And let's say you simply recapture. Well, then white's going to trade queens. You're in check, so you have to take. And here you're in a really awkward position. Your king is now uncastled, stuck in the center. You lost your castling rights. You can't castle anymore. You're also pinned. Your knight's pinned. So it's a pretty awkward and bad position for you. So this is really something that should be avoided. And also note, you kind of have to take this pawn. If you don't take this pawn, well, this pawn is threatening your knight, and this bishop is pinning your knight to your queen. So if you castled here or something, you're just losing your knight. So both options are pretty poor. So a better option in this position is to either castle and finish your development, or alternatively, instead of castling, you could play just knight d7 and develop your knight as well. Either of these ideas is fine. There are other knight moves that are also okay, but just keeping it simple, just developing your pieces. In the game, we don't see the e5 move punished with the recapture. Instead, white trades bishops, black recaptures, and then there's a trade in the center. White plays this mysterious queen d3 move, and Brock doesn't really understand this. I agree, it's a weird, baffling move. I don't think it does that much. So black's response is perfect. Just castling makes a lot of sense, and is probably your best move. White develops their knight, and in this position, Brock plays rook d8. Sensible move, attacking the queen and forcing the queen to move to another square. You're also now controlling this central d file. But instead of this move, I want you to pause and consider if there are any better moves in this position. Hopefully you found this move pretty quickly. The main idea is that thing we discussed before with the long diagonals. So here, black is threatening to take this knight with the queen, and this is simply winning. At this point, black would be up a full piece for nothing, which is a huge advantage. Having awareness of these long diagonals is going to be the decider at this kind of elo. So paying attention to these opportunities when they exist is super important. And this just comes with practice, being able to visualize these long diagonals and looking for these moves. So in this position, instead of taking the free knight, instead Brock plays this rook d8 idea, pressuring the queen. Queen moves, pushes the rook forward, attacking the queen. This allows Brock to create a battery with the queen and rook along this d file. This makes sense. It makes sense to seize control of this file. The main problem with this move is just you are pinning your knight to the defense of the queen. So if this knight were to move, then white would be able to capture your queen. So in this position, the same idea could be achieved with less risk by just playing queen to d7. Again, we're ignoring that the knight is hanging in this position, but just with the way you're thinking, it's important to look at other options, and pinning yourself to your own knight, if you can avoid it, it's something that just gives you some more flexibility. Now your knight has the ability to jump in at some point in the future. So in the game, white retreats the knight, black develops, which is the best plan. Play continues. One thing to note here is that white's king is still in the center, still not castled, and we have these forward pawns, which you don't really want to be pushing pawns in front of your king, because often it creates a weakness. So it's something that white probably should not have done. And next, Brock plays this rook d8 idea. Not that this is an immediate blunder, but it does pin his knight to the defense of the rook. So now he has a little less flexibility with his knight. So this is something that should be considered before making this move. From this position, play continues. White develops. Black forces an exchange. White advances pawns near black's king. We reach this position, and Brock retreats because his rook is under attack. But in this position, instead of this rook retreating move, there is a better move. So take a second and pause and see if you can find a better move. Hopefully you notice that the queen and king are lined up, and that playing the bishop to b4 pins the queen to the defense of the king. So this is going to allow you to win a queen. And as you can see, the engine evaluates this as a huge advantage for black. So it's important when your opponent makes a threat that you don't reactively just move your piece outside of that threat. It's important to look for what are called in-between moves or zwischenzugs or intermezzos. These moves are often very powerful, and it's something worth considering in this position. And I think here you moved relatively quickly. So again, this is an opportunity to spend a little bit more time. So instead, Brock retreated his rook. We have a few more moves. And Brock plays this move with the idea of pinning the knight to the defense of the queen, which is a solid move. Again, Black should really be calculating intermediate moves. And this is not an absolute pin. And what I mean by that is, it's not like moving this knight is illegal. It just maybe is ill-advisable because then you could win the queen. In this position, White has this very tricky response, which it's actually not super straightforward to refute. Black would need to see the following combination. So if you took this queen and they take your queen, you would need to find this check. After checking here, now we're up a clean exchange, and we're absolutely crushing. But in this position, if we just take the knight, then it's evenish. So these moves are tricky and probably should be calculated. At your level, though, I like the idea behind this pin. So in this position, Brock cashes in on this pinned piece, playing b5, which is a good move. There's actually another move which exists in this position, so if you want to pause and try to find another tactic. And actually the same theme of this diagonal comes into play with some geometry with the knight, which is a little tricky to see. But you can actually play the bishop here, and if the queen recaptures, you have this beautiful fork of all the pieces. So you're winning back the queen. So after this pawn move, Black is looking to cash in on this pin, and White retreats the queen. Brock recaptures the pawn. There is a better move that here in the annotation he found. So if you want to pause here, hopefully you can see it. Hopefully in this position you found the killer fork, forking the king, the queen, and the rook. This would obviously win a huge amount of material, would make the game very easy to finish up. So in the game, Black continues by taking the knight instead. And again, we missed the fork on this turn. I think slowing down in this position is a good idea. Now, on this move, we captured this free pawn. It's good that Brock is recognizing these free pawns. He said in the commentary that he didn't want to go for something that just was a queen trade because he was hoping there was something better. But actually, in these sorts of positions, Black is already up a huge amount of material, a full piece. So a queen trade would be advantageous, and that's actually one of the best ways to close out a game where you're up in material. So playing this fork would be a great trade. So even though your queen is also under attack, let's say if the king moves and you take and recapture, in this position, you're up a clear rook. It's a massive advantage, and this would be very easy to close out without much counterplay. So in this position, Brock captures the free pawn, and he says, just taking the free piece seems logical as the center is quite tied up. I actually think that's a little flawed thinking in this type of position. So you're already up a huge amount of material. An extra pawn is not going to make a big difference. But if you look at this position, you'll notice that your king is a little loose. There's a pawn right in front, defending a square right in front of your king. The only way you lose this position is if you accidentally get checkmated. So what you should be trying to do is either deliver checkmate or try to stabilize your position. So there are many other moves in this position that are worth considering. Queen b5 is an interesting idea, which is controlling some more squares in front of the king, threatening to deliver a check with your rook. Some other ideas are just developing your bishop, bringing another attacker, or even just king h7, which, although this maybe is not the most precise move, it does add a defender to this pawn. So after takes, our king is safe enough. And we should be able to stabilize this enough to close out the game. Instead, in the game, we'll see that Brock's king gets a little loose and a little weak. So white captures this pawn in front of the king. And after this check, Brock opts for this king g7 idea, which is risky because of what we see in the game. So the queen comes in, and this is actually very scary. Better in this position, rather than giving white this check, would be to tuck the king away into the corner. Now, this is no longer with check, so black has one free tempo to push their own initiative. So after this queen check, black retreats, and the queen captures this pawn. Now, for those of you who think Brock is just sacking his queen, if knight recaptures, this is checkmate. So this is actually a sound move. And in the game, this is where things start to get a little crazy. In this position, Brock plays rook d to d2. At this point, you should pause and find the killer idea for white. For some people, this is hard to visualize, but in fact, there is checkmate in 1. Queen g8 is checkmate. So this was a losing move. Lucky for Brock, his opponent missed this idea, and after rook d to d2, white greeds for the queen instead of checkmating. It's interesting because Brock says massive stuff up for me, which is true. But going back to this position, there's no reason to give up your queen in this kind of position. It just makes your life much more difficult than it needs to be. The key ideas here should be avoiding getting checkmated yourself, which could be a simple move like this. Bringing the queen back, adding defense to some of the light squares around the king, defending the checkmating square. Another idea would be adding another attacker to this knight. And now the knight is pinned. Finally, another cool tactical combination is rook takes. If king takes, you win a rook. This is another position that should be easy to mop up. Next turn, we're mopping up this pawn, and white has no chance of winning this game. In this position, Brock captures the free piece. It's a good move. The king retreats. Brock continues with the tempo, which is the best idea. Now, in this move, Brock recaptures this pawn, but there is a better move, so pause in this position. Hopefully you found in this position, bringing either of the rooks over with check wins the queen, skewering the king to the queen. So after the king moves, let's say taking the knight, we win the queen. We have 2 rooks and a bishop against a single rook, and we're going to mop up this pawn. So this is an easy one. Also note that the dark square bishop is defending against checks. So as is classic in beginner games, white misses an opportunity to checkmate. It is a checkmate in 10, so it's a little difficult to find. But this underscores the concept from earlier. The only way to lose this game as black is to have an exposed king. So spending those extra turns earlier to make sure your king is safe really pay dividends later in the game. In the actual game, play proceeds as follows. And this is actually a perpetual check. It's hard to find, so we won't go into it. And here in time trouble, Brock forgets that the knight is hanging. It is sometimes difficult to remember that these knights move like this. That would have been the best move. In the game, this is how play proceeds. And white gives up the queen for a rook, which is just completely lost. And then I'll go through this pretty quickly. Black is able to just mop up the rest of the material and eventually delivers checkmate with this ladder sequence, which you will find right here. So good job on Brock on closing this out. For game 2, we have Brock opening with an Italian, starting with e4. And we end up in pretty standard structure here. One important moment in this position, it would be a mistake for black to double up on this pin, Although it looks decisive, there's actually a trap here similar to the Legalis trap with knight takes. And if the bishop takes our queen, we're actually going to be delivering checkmate. So that is a move to be avoided. Play continues, and black retreats the bishop. I can understand the intent behind this move for black, just reinforcing the f7 square. However, it's a little odd to move this piece twice in the opening. So black moved it to g4 and then decided that it was better on e6. And this is basically just giving white a free tempo or turn. So that's ill-advisable for black. Brock pushes a pawn. Alternatively, retreating the bishop is also an idea worth considering in these types of positions. We see an exchange. And Brock says here he sees an opportunity to attack the f7 square. This idea struck me as a little premature. I think better in this position would be continuing development, maybe bringing the bishop out. And the reason is that this knight move, although there is this immediate idea of bringing the queen in through one of these two squares, the problem is it's pretty easy to defend. So, for example, this didn't happen in the game, but black could have played something like this. And although the bishop is a little tied up, eventually black is going to be able to push this pawn, kick the knight, and you invested a fair amount of time and didn't achieve too much. So I think a better effort here would have been just continuing development. Black ends up finding a different defensive idea by retreating the knight, which gives space for the queen to now defend, so maybe queen to d7, which should be fine. But actually instead, after Brock plays this aggressive queen move, targeting the f7 square, threatening checkmate, so this threat needs to be addressed, black tries to defend in this way, which proves to be a mistake. In his notes, Brock says that worst case, he can bring his knight into the center to e6, and maybe he'll trade knights. In this position, this is something that you need to concretely calculate, because in some similar positions like this, you've actually trapped your own knight. So for example, after the queen moves, notice how the knight actually has no escape squares. All the squares where the knight would go are occupied. So at this point, if you calculated that you had no way out, you would want to give up the knight for this bishop, and then at least you're maintaining material equality. Brock goes for this idea and just defends the knight. But in this position, I'd like you to pause and see if you can find a nice tactic. If you found the aggressive idea of knight to d5, then you got the correct answer. Notice how if the queen takes the knight, you're actually getting forked, and white is winning back the queen. So that would not be a good option for black. And if you just move the queen somewhere, at the very least, you can win additional material with this fork in the center. And after the king moves, we can win this rook. Brock finds the same idea on his next turn and proceeds to mop up some material. So Brock asks here if there was some better option other than taking the rook, but I think going up a clear rook in this position is more than sufficient. It is a good idea to look for better options, but this is fine. And as play proceeds, Brock gets his pieces activated, and this is an interesting moment. Brock decides to actually sacrifice a piece to get a stronger attack on the king. And after this knight recaptures, this is a good moment to pause and consider what the best move is. So hopefully in this position, you avoided the temptation to just recapture this knight. And you notice that the bishop is indirectly attacking the king through what's called an X-ray. So if the knight moves, then the bishop will be checking the king. Also notice that the queen is covering many squares in front of the king. So if you notice most of the escape squares are being covered by your pieces, often you want to calculate concrete variations and see if there's a checkmate threat. And in this position, there are actually two forced checkmates. The first is this discovered check. So if the king retreats, queen here is checkmate. And instead, the computer gives this variation, which seems a little odd that you're just giving up your queen, but it just prevents mate for a few more moves. And after bishop takes and the king tries to escape, this is checkmate. The faster checkmate actually starts out with what Brock played in the game. In this position, you should pause and try to find the checkmate in one. So the mate in one in this position is queen d7. And you'll notice that these two squares behind the king are blocked by their own pieces. And this pattern is a good one to know. And this is checkmate. Instead, in the game, Brock plays this check, which is still a strong move, and still white should be able to win this. And it looks like black has no options, but the best option for black is just to give up the queen. It's the only legal move in the position. So we'll continue here for a few moves, and white has a massive advantage. This should be an easy game to close out. Brock starts liquidating material and just mopping up free pieces, but I think it's a little bit lazy in this position, and the key thing to note is that the king is running out of squares. So the king is boxed in by your rook. Two ideas here. One, just checking. It's very close to checkmate. I think it is actually a forced mate. And another idea would be bringing the queen in, applying additional pressure, and then following up with the same idea here. The queen can also come into this square and start attacking pawns in front of the king. In any case, both of these moves would be very strong. From here, I'm going to just fast forward a little bit. We have Brock creating a lot of pressure, and black really doesn't have many options. Massive material deficit, so Brock is able to mop up most of the pieces. You may have noticed the game results in this game is a draw, and the only way for a game with this large of a material advantage for white to end in a draw is through stalemate. For those who don't know, stalemate is when your opponent has no legal moves, but they are not in check. So you're not threatening to capture their king on that turn. And that's actually a draw in chess. So I'm going to go over a few strategies for avoiding stalemate. The first is actually not taking all of your opponent's pieces. So when your opponent has a few pawns, they have legal moves and it won't be stalemate. So you could just take this pawn and run it up the board, get two queens, and deliver checkmate. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is just identifying at least one legal move for your opponent with your candidate move. So just verify, just make sure it's not stalemate every move. It's a little harder, you can make mistakes, but that is a sound way of avoiding stalemate. Another strategy that's pretty common at this elo is the always be checking strategy. So on every turn, you just deliver check. And it's either going to be just another check or it's checkmate. You have enough pieces here that you could probably do something like this here, and likely you would just end up checkmating your opponent. Finally, one strategy you can employ that comes from bullet, and you can see here Brock had about 40 seconds, so maybe he's not comfortable having that little time on his clock. But one strategy is actually to throw away material, given how many pieces you have. Your queen, even though the queen is one of the best checkmating pieces, it's also a really good piece at delivering stalemate. So one thing you could do here, after, let's say, mopping up all the pieces, is just give up the queen. And in this position, this is super easy to win. You can just get a bunch of queens, run your pawns up the board, and now black has no moves you even need to consider. So this simplifies the thinking because you just have fewer opponent moves you have to consider. I'll finish the game here just so we can see what happened in the actual game. In this position, Brock actually missed checkmate in one. So this check does deliver mate. And if you can visualize that the rook is cutting off the squares here, we just checked with the queen and that delivers mate. Unfortunately, Brock missed that. and liquidated all the pieces, and then eventually gets 2 queens. So as I said, the more queens you have on the board, if you're not delivering check at that point, there's a risk of stalemate. So in this position, best option is definitely just deliver check with each piece. And this position, even though Brock has a massive material advantage, is stalemate because all the squares around the king are covered, but the king is not in check. So that's a draw. In our final game, we have Brock playing black, and against e4, he opts for the Sicilian defense. I do think the Sicilian defense can be pretty complicated, so it's actually not an opening I would recommend for players at this rating, unless you really want to study the theory. It is a very strong option, but it is also something where you're likely to run into theoretical variations. So for that reason, I would adopt some other openings. So we see a normal-ish opening, although Brock says he doesn't understand the intent behind this bishop move and responds by blocking the check with his own bishop. This plan makes sense. The idea for white here is just early castling. You're going to give up your bishop, but you're going to be castled, and black's going to have a few more moves before you're finished castling. So it's not a totally illogical move from white. White recaptures the bishop, and we enter into this position where black fianchettos. And Brock says he's unfamiliar with a position where he's fianchettoed against a fianchettoed opponent's bishop. This is a pretty common position you'll see. There's nothing super problematic about it for either side, although one thing to consider is that this bishop is currently undefended. So sometimes in these positions, tactics arise where you can actually win this bishop. Next, Brock plays this d5 move, and he says he's not really sure why he played it and probably should have castled, and I agree. This is an aggressive move, and the main reason why this is not a good idea, it's just because your own bishop is also undefended because you haven't castled yet. You would like to be able to take back with your knight, and this would be a good move, although in this position, you just hang a bishop, so that's why it's ill-advised here. And instead, what happens in the game is Brock has to recapture with his queen, and this can be problematic because having your queen out in the center in the opening is just a target for your opponent's pieces, and you'll end up burning a number of moves just trying to save your queen. Here, white responds by pushing aggressively in the center. So Brock retreats, and white attacks the center and gets rid of this backwards pawn. So that's a good plan from white. And here, I think the best move is actually to take, as scary as it is. And you'll see that's actually what the engine recommends here. And the reason is if you allow white to place a pawn on d5, then your e-pawn is forever constrained by this forward pawn, and your position becomes cramped, and we'll see that happen in the game. So rather than taking, black castles, which is probably the second best move in this position. But after this e5 move, we see black is very constrained. As Brock tries to hold on to this position, we see white developing their pieces, and Brock tries to attack the center, which, if you could get away with this move, I think the idea is sound. You can create an isolated pawn in the center and potentially win that later on. Here, Brock runs into a little bit of trouble, though. As white is able to swing their knight in, and black retreats, but this allows another piece to come in with a tempo, and after the queen retreats again, the pawn can be pushed with a tempo, and you'll notice here the rook is trapped. So that was a very unfortunate sequence. So a skill I think Brock could work on, and most beginner players could work on, is evaluating the trade-offs between similar seeming moves when you're in a position like this where you're forced to move your piece. So the queen is under attack by the knight. We want to move the queen somewhere, but we have a number of legal squares where we could move. But how do we decide which of those are good options and which are bad? Well, first, obviously, we want to eliminate moves where the square would just immediately result in our queen getting captured. So this square, the knight would take us. This square, the pawn would take us. This square, the bishop would take us. and this square, one of these two pawns would take us. Next, we want to consider what one move threats the opponent can make after we make this next move. So basically look 2 moves deep. So for example, if we go to a6, this allows a fork of the queen and the rook. Similarly, if we go to e7, this allows the pawn to be pushed with a tempo, and the knight is following up after. And the move that was played in the game has a similar problem, where the knight is coming in, attacking the queen with a tempo, we move the queen, and we're in a rough spot. If we move our queen too far, this allows the white bishop to come in, attacking our queen, so we lose a tempo again, and now this knight's going to swing in and pick up the rook, or possibly our queen is going to get trapped over here on the king side. So we've really narrowed down our options here, and I think b6 is probably the best move here. At this point, you're just trying to calculate some explicit variations, but the main point is we've eliminated the moves that are obviously bad. In the game, Brock plays queen d7, the knight enters, and we lose a few tempos, and now the rook is trapped. Brock tries to save some material, and this is the right idea. I think also the move that the engine is recommending here is probably what I would play as well, where the benefit of this is you're not destroying your pawn structure, whereas when you play the knight here, when the knight recaptures, you're going to have doubled pawns. Also, this knight blockades the passed pawn, which can be a useful feature, which makes it more difficult for white to promote the pawn. So that's what happened in the game. White did take this knight and destroy the pawn structure, and then white captured this rook. And then things get a little weird. So in this position, the knight is just completely free. And instead of taking the free knight, which has 2 attackers, so this bishop is attacking, the queen's attacking, but it's only defended once by the bishop, so this knight is completely hanging. White should take this and have an easy win. Instead, white opts to attack the rook. In response, black doubles up on this file, and pieces begin to liquidate off the board. And then white plays this inexplicable move. I'm not sure if this was a mouse slip or something else, but now black is absolutely crushing, and Brock takes advantage of that and takes the free rook. Here white starts greeting for pawns, and black develops and attacks this weakness. Just like in the opening, the f2 pawn and the f7 pawn can be weak later in the game as well. So this is only defended by the king and the rook, and we've added 2 attackers, and maybe we can swing the queen in. So potentially we'll have an attack here. So I think here Brock was a little afraid of the enemy queen kind of deep in his territory. So he moves his king up, and I think this is a poor idea, mostly because the king is actually really safe here. So even if you move the queen, let's say I played this on this turn, attacking this piece, any queen check is not really doing much. I just move out of the way. And this bishop is protecting this whole diagonal. So I'm not really in any danger of being checkmated. So I don't need to worry about that random queen check here. So after white greeds for yet another pawn, Brock finds an incredible and aggressive idea. So if you want to pause here and try to find it. Brock plays the aggressive and accurate rook takes f2. And here he says he made a mistake because he didn't realize that the king is defending the rook. But there is a killer follow-up to this move. So again, in this position, you can pause and try to find the killer follow-up. In this position, black can pile up on this pinned piece and play queen f6. And even though it looks like the rook is attacking the square, well, it's actually not legal to move the rook because that would be putting the king in check. So this is an absolute pin. It is not legal to move this rook. And general guidance with pin pieces is you want to add as many attackers to the pin piece as possible, and that's the case here. And if the king moves, the king is getting checkmated very shortly, and this is hard to avoid. In the game, Brock wins the exchange instead, and we see Brock using his queen to pressure the king. And if you watch the engine eval, Brock has a completely crushing and winning position here, and eventually a forced mate. But this is kind of the critical moment where he lets it slip with this king move. And the reason why is the king is basically in a mating net. These squares are all covered by your queen. This square is covered. This square is covered by the pawn. This is the only remaining square. And if we could give check, if we had a free move, we would want to push the pawn and deliver check this way. And that's why g5 is the winning idea. And any move here is going to get checkmated. This is checkmate. And the queen can sacrifice itself to delay the mate for one turn, but this mate is inevitable. So the main idea here is when you see the king really constrained, see if you can add just one of your pieces or pawns to control some of those additional squares, or maybe defend your piece. So in this case, this g5 move allows the queen to give check on the f4 square. It's not the easiest idea to see, but it's a skill that you can practice. And here, if the queen tries to prevent you from checking on f4, this is checkmate. So this mate would be unavoidable here. In the game, Brock kind of loses the thread a little bit and delivers this check, which loses a pawn. And now he's in a losing pawn endgame. At this point, though, he makes what I would call the final deciding blow in the game. If you ignore the engine evaluation, as a human, the only way that Black can win this game is by somehow stopping these pawns from promoting and then promoting your own pawn here and just running it up the board. It's not actually going to work, but it's your only last desperate try. And in this game, this pawn move, well, you're not going to be in time to stop this pawn, and it's very easy for the white king to stop your pawn. So I think better here would just be to try to run the king to stop the pawn, and you'll notice you're actually one turn in time to stop the pawn. Now, again, if you look at the engine valuation, let's play some random king move. It looks like this is a trivial, easy win, but for a human, you actually need to find some tricky ideas. So for instance, if white tries to push this pawn, well, now we're going to promote. And actually, Black is winning here. And one other thing to note is if white tries to attack this pawn, and we're not going to be able to get there in time to stop this idea, well, now this pawn runs, and now Black wins. So the tricky idea that white needs to find here is not taking this f pawn, but creating a passed pawn on the outside of the board by playing the g pawn forward, and then eventually creating an outside pass pawn like so. Either this way, and our king is blocked, so we can't stop that, and white would get a queen. Or even if we take, it's the same problem. And again, we're blocked, and white is getting a queen. So that's the main winning idea for white. But again, at this elo, anything is possible in these sorts of pawn endgames. In the game, Brock tries to run his pawn, but as I said, it is easy for white's king to stop. He loses the pawn race, and he resigns in this position. All right, time to break down Brock's strengths and weaknesses. So first, I think it's pretty clear that you've got a really aggressive fighting play style. Your play is active and you end up applying lots of pressure. I think that's a great habit to continue. You also, in general, developed quickly. And in some positions, when you didn't know what to do, you would castle, which is a great intuition. And that's what I'd like to see most beginners doing. And finally, your pieces were placed actively. And what I mean by this was you made sure that you involved all of your pieces in the game. You had your knights active in the center. And for that reason, you actually had a forced checkmate in every single game. So that's a great sign that in general, you're playing aggressively and actively and not just letting your opponent dictate the game. Now let's move on to areas for improvement. So first, I think you could work on your board vision, and I think this is going to be common for most beginner players. So this includes examining the interaction between pieces across the full board. So looking at those long diagonals, making sure you're taking pieces when your opponent is giving you a free hanging piece, considering all the possible moves for knights and bishops and queens, and also remembering that pawns are involved as well and can defend key squares. Second, I think you were rushing the opening, particularly in lines where you weren't in specific theory. And against beginner players, you'll often be able to gain a huge advantage in the opening if you slow down. Next, I think practicing your calculation on the trade-offs between similar seeming moves would benefit you. So there were a few positions in all of the games where you had a few similar seeming moves, and the move you chose ended up resulting in a poor position, but there were other moves available that would have given you a better position. Finally, I think practicing king safety and spending a few moves just making sure your king is safe in the middle game and end game, even if you're way up in material, is a good habit to develop. We saw that in game 1, you actually gave your opponent checkmate because you disregarded king safety, and better players will punish you for that mistake. So for your training plan, I'm going to recommend going on Lichess and practicing forced checkmate patterns in 1 or 2 moves. So this is a new option that they just added. I'll link to it below. And I think you'll see a massive payoff because you had many positions where you had checkmate. And if you practice these patterns, you'll be able to cash in on that in the game. Next, I think you would benefit from general tactical training. And this is going to be true for all beginner players. This is probably the number one skill that's going to distinguish a total beginner from an intermediate player from an expert player. And you can train this with tactics puzzles on chess.com, Lichess, or Chess Tempo. And the key thing is to really concentrate and calculate variations, visualizing in your head before you play the first move. All right, and finally, I think you should spend at least 10 seconds on every move, even in the opening. You really need to practice slowing down and taking advantage of your opponent's early mistakes. Now, you may end up losing a few more games on time, but hopefully the games that you're losing are in better positions. And eventually, as you train more, you'll be able to grind out won positions, even when you're low on time. And with that, we conclude our first episode of Beginner Breakdown. Huge shout out to Brock. Thank you so much for submitting your games. I really enjoyed reading your analysis and performing my own analysis on the game. Some really exciting games there. Pretty sure you're going to be hitting 1200 in no time. And if you have any questions or feedback, please add them in the comments. I'm definitely looking to improve the format in the future. And I'm also beginning to collect game submissions for my next episode. So if you're a beginner player rated under 1200, shoot me an email with an example game and your own analysis, and you might get included in the next episode. So with that, thank you again for your time, and see you later.